Hello and welcome to this Q&A on Zone 2. My name is Dmitry Sokolov. I'm a board-certified lifestyle medicine physician. And Zone 2 is a question which often emerges when I speak to the clients or in the public. It's something we have heard about a lot and something I feel that each of us needs clarity on because it's such a fundamental and essential component to our exercise domain of lifestyle that yields quite a good return on investment as pertinent to our health span and lifespan. So in this Q&A, we shall discuss Zone 2 and go through the most frequent questions that are asked about its importance, about the benefits, about how to define Zone 2, how to trace Zone 2, what it actually is in terms of the level of physical activity and what types of activity are best suitable for Zone 2. So I will keep it quite simple, and for those of you who have no knowledge about Zone 2 at all, you'll get full clarity after this Q&A. But also if you have knowledge and experience in exercise in general and in Zone 2 training, I'm certain that you will get insights and viewpoints useful for your further practice. And we'll start with the first question, which is what is Zone 2? Zone 2 essentially is a training that falls between a light and moderate intensity, and sometimes we refer to it as a fat burning zone or LISS cardio, which stands for low intensity steady state cardio. In essence, it is the maximum intensity of cardio activity that we can generate while utilizing exclusively aerobic system to produce energy, or predominantly aerobic system. And thus, this level of activity is sustainable pretty much for an unlimited duration, provided we have effective mitochondria that are used to this type of activity, and we're trained to work in this zone, and provided we deliver fuel, which is nutrients. So we can go forever in Zone 2, these conditions, if these conditions are fulfilled. Is aerobic training and cardio the same? This is a very important question, and this is something that many people get wrong because these terms are used interchangeably. We say aerobic training, we imply cardio, and vice versa, but they are not the same, and the confusion stems from the fact that essentially, cardio is an umbrella term for cardiovascular exercise. It's a shortened version, cardiovascular exercise. And sometimes it's also referred to as endurance exercise. And as such, it is any physical activity that raises our heart rate and breathing for a certain period of time. And usually people put an equality sign between cardio and aerobic exercise, but this is more to emphasize the difference of that activity from other types of exercise like strength and resistance exercise, balance and mobility training, so that we know that this is something distinct from them. But it's important for us to understand that the so-called cardio zones engage different energy systems of our body. Zone 1 and 2 is aerobic, zones 4 and 5 are anaerobic, and as such we cannot really equate the physiological health and longevity effects of Zone 1 and 2 cardio as compared to Zone 4 and 5. All that is cardio, but not all that is aerobic exercise. So the main feature of Zone 2 cardio is that it does utilize aerobic metabolism, which means energy is generated by oxidation of substrates, carbohydrates and fatty acids. And because it is aerobic, lactate is not produced and serum lactate levels are less than 2 millimoles per liter. And if we're talking training for longevity and health rather than performance in a specific type of sport, then training Zone 2 and Zone 5 is most important. And now we just move naturally into the third question, which is what does aerobic mean and how is it different from anaerobic? And in order to get clarity with this, we need to briefly look into the three different systems that our body can use to produce energy. These systems don't work in isolation, they work simultaneously and synchronously, but depending on the type and duration of activity, that is, if we need energy immediately, we need energy short term or we need it long term, then one of these energy systems shall dominate the others. Look into how energy is produced. Does this energy production involve any oxygen, and what are the byproducts formed during this energy generation by each system? And what could be the limiting factor for each of those systems that would suggest, okay, they can produce a certain amount of energy within the certain range, but they cannot produce it any further? What would be the limiting factor? So the first system is ATP-CP, or ATP creatine phosphate. This system is also known as phosphagen system. And this system is unique in that it provides immediate energy for short maximum intensity activity bursts for like up to 10 seconds. For example, if somebody runs a 100-meter sprint, or if we do a heavy 1-rep max lift, then we would be utilizing the ATP-CP system. As for fuel, it relies on the stored ATP, so it breaks down the ATP to cleave off the phosphate, freeing up the energy, and that leaves us with ADP, which then regenerates into ATP from the stored creatine phosphate. As the whole chain of these actions implies, there is no oxygen used and there are no byproducts formed. And obviously, we understand that the limiting factor for that is the stores of creatine phosphate in the muscle cell, because as we deplete our creatine phosphate stores, we can no longer regenerate ADP into ATP. And this is exactly where the creatine supplementation taps into, as it increases the creatine phosphate stores within the cells, allowing us to regenerate more ADP into ATP as the part of the system. But I would like to highlight again that the ATP-CP system relates to immediate energy production from ATP, instant for your kind of 100-meter sprint, for your 1-rep max lift, but it doesn't play an important role if we're talking zone 2, and we'll get to that in a second. So the second system is anaerobic system. If we said ATP-CP system is immediate energy, then anaerobic system is short-term energy. And thus it provides energy for high-intensity activity that lasts between 10 seconds and 2 to 3 minutes. For example, if we're talking a 400-meter sprint, then this system will be dominating. It is also called glycolytic/lactic acid system because it uses glucose or stored glycogen, which is a glucose polymer, for fuel. It doesn't use any oxygen, and as byproducts it produces hydrogen ions and pyruvate. And then the pyruvate is undergoing, in anaerobic conditions, undergoing conversion to lactate. So both these metabolites, lactate and hydrogen ions, build up in the cell as a result of utilizing this anaerobic glycolytic system to produce energy, and as a result we feel burning sensation in the muscle. And the limiting factors, as you would have guessed, would be running out of substrate, that is running out of glucose or glycogen, as well as buildup of lactate and hydrogen ions. Because as lactate and hydrogen ions build up in the cell, they would alter cellular environment and inhibit glycolytic enzymes. So that the glycolysis no longer is effective, but also the hydrogen ions would displace calcium in the muscle cells, and thus they would hinder muscle contractility. So we kind of reach the ceiling at which anaerobic system no longer can effectively generate further amounts of energy. And here we get to the third system, which is aerobic system. And aerobic system relies on long-term, low-intensity oxidation of different substrates, mainly glucose and fats, so fatty acids. It can also engage protein as a substrate, but something really bad needs to be happening with the body if it needs to oxidize its own proteins as a fuel. For example, it's someone on intensive care with severe sepsis, unable to eat for several days, then the body would figure out, okay, I'm no longer being supplied with glucose. I've exhausted all my glycogen stores. I've also exhausted my fat stores if the patient, for example, before that was not rich in fat tissue, and thus the only reserve that is left is the protein in the muscle, so the system will utilize that protein to produce energy, and that would be the same aerobic system. And as byproducts of this system, it's just carbon dioxide and water, which are easily expelled from the cell. And in terms of limitation, essentially, as you can understand, this system can go on and on for as long as we get oxygen into the cell and we give substrate for oxidation, that is fatty acids or glucose, or we get our own protein oxidized. As I mentioned before, these systems work simultaneously, but if we take, for example, a boxing round, it would rely on both anaerobic glycolytic system and aerobic system, but the engagement of them would be in about 2-to-1 ratio, so it will be predominantly anaerobic glycolytic system, and on top of that we get some aerobic engagement. So I hope that makes it clear on what energy systems we have in the body and how they interplay depending on the intensity of activity, its duration, and depending on the use or not use of oxygen and different substrates for energy production. Moving on to the next question, why is zone 2 specifically emphasized? If we look at the literature on lifestyle, on longevity, if we look at different health blogs, zone 2 pitches up quite often. Firstly, this is the intensity of cardio activity that improves the function of existing mitochondria and also promotes the development of new mitochondria, the so-called mitochondrial biogenesis. And the more numerous and efficient mitochondria we have, the more capacity we have to produce energy aerobically. And this is something really good to have. And this is also where zone 2 links with longevity, because one of the hallmarks of aging is exactly mitochondrial dysfunction, as it is also a hallmark of chronic disease. So by enhancing mitochondrial health and function through zone 2 aerobic training, we tap into health span and lifespan promotion. Also, we need to acknowledge that training in zone 2, we improve our body's ability to utilize fat as a primary fuel, because we use this oxidative metabolism, we use aerobic system that oxidizes fatty acids, and we train to utilize fat as a fuel, and this helps us burn fat not only during exercise but also at rest. By being very efficient in zone 2 and training zone 2 on a regular basis in a sufficient way, we also enhance our ability to burn fat at rest. And we then enable something that's called metabolic flexibility, the ability to switch between fat and carb metabolism effectively. And this is a hallmark of good metabolic health. Also, looking at the broader context, zone 2 is an important foundation for building higher intensity performance. So if we build robust aerobic base by training regular and sufficient zone 2, we will also be able to sustain higher efforts for longer, and we will recover more quickly. On this same note, I'd like to mention zone 5 training, which is purely anaerobic and is linked with improving our VO2 max. And this is also essential for our health span and lifespan, because high VO2 max highly correlates with reduced all-cause mortality risk. So with my clients, I put emphasis on both training zone 2 and zone 5 on a regular basis. And zone 5 has its own specific protocols that are totally different from zone 2 training, and which we won't tackle today. The next question, how much zone 2 do I need to get the benefit? The minimum of zone 2, and this is endorsed by Physical Activity Guidelines for Americans, by American Heart Association, by American College of Lifestyle Medicine, and many others, is 150 minutes per week of a sort of heart pumping activity. And if we are more precise, then most often we will come across recommendations of 150 minutes of moderate intensity or 75 minutes of vigorous intensity cardio per week, which are deemed equivalent in terms of mortality reduction benefit. And if we're talking zone 2 physiology specifically, it is exactly this moderate type of activity, and then we're looking at 150 minutes per week or more, and the more the better. If we do more than 150 minutes per week, we will see slight plateauing of the benefit, but the benefit will still be there and will be rising. There was a study published in Circulation in 2022 which concluded that weekly 300 minutes of moderate or 150 minutes of vigorous activity or equivalent combination of both was associated with near maximum reduction in mortality. If we look at the graphs, the mortality risk reduction with more zone 2 or more moderate activity continues beyond 300 minutes per week, whereas with more vigorous activity, that is zone 3-4 levels, such reduction is less pronounced beyond 150 minutes per week. And this is for all-cause mortality and non-cardiovascular disease mortality. But if we look specifically at the cardiovascular, the CVD mortality, we then see that there is an increase of risk with vigorous activity beyond 150 minutes per week, whereas with moderate or zone 2 activity, we continue seeing the risk reduction benefit beyond 300 minutes. To summarize, I suggest if you're a beginner, you start with aiming 150 minutes or 3 hours per week. Then you progress to 4 hours per week, and then 300 minutes per week, which is 5 hours. And then you can review later depending on your goals and on your needs and on your resources. Moving on to the next question, number 6. Can I train too much in zone 2? I'll be short on this. While zone 2 training is generally considered safe and sustainable, we can still overtrain if we push too hard or too much, or use the type of activity that is suboptimal for our specific situation. For example, if we go wild and running with bad knees, then certainly we will get bad results from that. However, if we remember the Circulation 2022 study and graphs, if we go further beyond 300 minutes per week of zone 2 of moderate activity, we still get the mortality reduction benefit. So if that suits your needs, if that fits your resources, your time and everything around it, then yes, you're unlikely going to get any negative effects. The next question is, how often should I train in zone 2? Now, the frequency of zone 2 training depends on the goals and the training history and patterns. For example, cyclists incorporate several zone 2 rides per week with a combination of higher intensity sessions and recovery days. I would practically suggest that you aim for whatever works for you. I wouldn't be didactic on suggesting that you only do sessions that are at least 20 minutes, or sessions that are at least 40 minutes, or sessions that are at least 60 minutes. You will come across opinions that in order to kick in with zone 2, with aerobic metabolism properly, you would need an X amount of time, for example, 40-minute session. And thus, if we think 150 minutes per week, then we equate that to somewhere 4 sessions of 40 minutes each. But I wouldn't be too didactic for the whole purpose of making it accessible and making it sustainable. If you are someone who can do a 30-minute brisk walk to work and back every day, so on 5 days of the week, and thus accrue 150 minutes per week, I think we will celebrate that together. Yes, you can go 40 plus minutes and probably get better outcomes in terms of engaging mitochondria, but if you do 20 minutes, 30 minutes, whatever works for you depending on your circumstances and resources, provided you are in zone 2, and we will get to that just now, then you're just fine. Moving on to the next question, how do I find my zone 2? And there are several metrics. Obviously, the gold standard is lactate measurement. So we check serum lactate, say we do a finger prick test, and if it's below 2 millimoles per liter, then we haven't been into the anaerobic levels of exercise and we have been functioning within the aerobic window and utilizing the aerobic system to generate energy. So lactate is a gold standard. Then there are other options based on heart rate, based on perceived exertion, and also the so-called talk test, to which I will return later because I think that is one of the most important indicators. The rate of perceived exertion, the RPE, we can look into 2 scales. There is a Borg scale, which is the original scale that ranges from 6 to 20. And on the Borg scale, we would be looking at 11 to 13 rate of perceived exertion. If we look at the modified RPE scale, which runs from 0 to 10, then we would be looking somewhere between 3 and 4. That would be our zone 2 rate of perceived exertion. Then there is a percentage of maximum heart rate. So there are options to both calculate your heart rate, so extrapolate it using the formula. For example, the most simple formula for maximum heart rate is 220 minus age. But there are also ways of actually determining the maximum heart rate by doing a certain exercise test, like a treadmill test, and actually getting your heart rate to the real maximum. And from that, we would say that zone 2 is around 70% and maybe up to 80% of maximum heart rate. If we go beyond that, we will be probably tapping into the anaerobic system. The third is the so-called talk test, which is dead simple, and it suggests if I can talk but not sing, then I'm in zone 2. So I have recently watched Peter Attia's Q&A on zone 2, which I think was from 4 years ago. And Peter was saying that he uses different metrics. He uses maximum heart rate percentage, he uses RPE, but he ultimately also checks his lactate. And what particularly struck me is the understanding that while the lactate is being checked at the end of the training, Peter would still gauge his level of activity. He would still gauge his output on the bike. He does it as an indoor bike. He would still gauge it based on the RPE, on how he would feel. And he noted that on one occasion when he was more rested, and on another occasion when he was less rested, he was doing exactly the same watts per kilogram of output. But at the end of these trainings, one of them showed lactate of 1.4 millimoles per liter, and another one showed the lactate of more than 2, I think 2.1. So he has overdone it slightly towards kind of zone 3, outside the zone 2 limits, which, as we have identified, are below 2 millimoles per liter lactate. On one occasion, when he was less rested and with exactly the same output, he has underdone it. It probably could have done slightly more output while still keeping lactate in the zone 2 bracket. So, and that brings me to conclusion, and this is essentially what I feel and suggest to the clients, that regardless of lactate, unless we do it continuously, we still gauge our performance to the RPE. We're still guided by the perceived exertion level as to how much output we generate during the training. And then we check lactate and see, okay, that was below 2 millimoles per liter. And we do that day to day to day to day. We do dozens of trainings like that. And we get the feeling of, okay, so this particular level of output would result in lactate below 2 millimoles per liter, roughly. So we get to learn our body and we get to compare the RPE to the outcome of lactate at the end of training. So in my reading, yes, lactate is gold standard, but it is also just a snapshot at the end of our training. And the main judging of am I in zone 2 is by the RPE. And lactate is used only for calibration. So when you do multiple bouts of zone 2, or what you think is zone 2, and check the lactate, you calibrate your own brain and your RPE to the real number. So I feel that up until we get continuous lactate monitoring options, which are now becoming available, so there is, hopefully will soon become available, let's put it this way. There's the Hydro or Hydro sensor, I don't know how to pronounce that correctly, which is a patch that measures lactate in the sweat. There's also the PK Vitality device, which uses a needle that samples from the interstitial space, the fluid between the cells, and determines both glucose and lactate in real time. So these would function in real time, and then we can get on our treadmill, on a bike, on elliptical, whatever, and we can track lactate real time as we perform that exercise to make sure we stay within zone 2. Up until then, I find lactate is quite secondary. It's good for calibration, it's probably good for high performance athletes, but for the majority of us, and for my regular client, I think that would be quite an overkill. Also, doing just a one-off lactate for the same reason, it doesn't make much sense, because you would need to do multiple bouts of training to calibrate your own perception of your RPE towards the lactate. Okay, and this is where the talk test comes in. The talk test is very simple. Light intensity activity is when we could sing while performing that activity. And this is, for example, I'm sitting, I'm in zone 1, I'm doing nothing. I could sing, I could do whatever. Or I'm moving about the house, or I'm taking a shower, I'm in zone 1, I can sing. Zone 2 is when we can talk without gasping for air, but we cannot sing. Zone 3 and 4 is already kind of more vigorous, where we would need to take a break to take a breath. And thus, although maximally subjective and probably the least accurate, it becomes, in my reading, the most sustainable and the most practically useful and simple test to determine if we are in zone 2. Now, there's a little caveat to that. Say, if you are guided by the zone 2 by talk test to determine your zone 2, and you, for example, go rocking, you put a rucksack with additional weight and you go hill climbing and things like that, hill walking, and you have your family with you, then if you've noticed that, and I've noticed that with my wife, we are engaged in a conversation, and what is zone 2 for me would be probably zone 3 for her, although she's a very trained individual, but we simply have different zones. And so you need to gauge that. Your partner in crime, if you do zone 2 together with your family, would need to have either similar aerobic capacity, so that they are in zone 2 while you're in zone 2, or you just need to put some more weight in your rucksack, and thus you would meet them in somewhere in the middle. But I suggest that zone 2 talk test determination is very simple, and you can use that in your daily practice. If you're performing an aerobic activity whereby you can talk but not sing, but you talk in sentences without gasping for air in between, you're spot on. Now, the last question is about the best types of zone 2 exercise and how can I make zone 2 training more effective. We can blend these two together. So there are many options to choose from. There is bike, indoor and outdoor, there is treadmill, there is elliptical, there's stairmaster, there's swimming, there's rocking and jogging, and more and more and more. The most important determinator of the type of activity we choose for zone 2 is our resources, our health, and availability of equipment. If we're talking bike, indoor, outdoor, there's certain factors that come in. You need to have the device at home. You need to have relevant weather conditions outside in order to be able to sustain that. If we're talking swimming, then access to the pool makes it, like, if you have no access to the pool, you can't really do your zone 2. Also, swimming is, to throw that in, is non-osteogenic. So that's the only activity that doesn't really add anything to your bone mineral density. Whereas rocking, for example, or cycling, that would add to your bone mineral density. Also, if we are talking elliptical or stairmaster or treadmill, again, we need the gym access for that. In my reading, the most simple is brisk walking and rocking. These don't require any gym. They pretty much are available 24/7. You can do them with your family, with your friends, taking into account what I've just said about your zone 2 may not be their zone 2, but you can mitigate that by putting additional weight, and this way you get also additional benefits. But I would say that brisk walking or rocking are the most simple types of activity to engage in and most sustainable and available. Now, one caveat here is about running, jogging. So if you have bad knees or you have bad lower back, then again, probably that activity won't work for you. Or if you have excessive weight, you shouldn't probably start with that. You should get your weight under control and within the normal range so that you don't ruin your joints, and then you can consider that as your zone 2 activity. So essentially, try different types of zone 2 activity, see which one works for you, and also gauge that against reality. For example, if you normally do your zone 2 as indoor cycling, you like to see the watts, you're very meticulous, you like to see watts per kilogram, you like to measure your lactate and things like that, you're very didactic about that. But then you go on holiday and you don't have access to any of that, but you have access to hill walking. Then you just go hill walking and rucking, and that's your zone 2 covered. So to sum it up, zone 2 is a type of physical activity, of aerobic activity, whereby it's as intense as to keep us utilizing only the aerobic system for energy production. And thus we stay within the bracket of lactate below 2 millimoles per liter. We can gauge that by measuring lactate by RPE of 3-4 out of 10, by talk test, which is we can talk but not sing, and we aim 150 minutes per week. The more the better, we get further effects of mortality risk reduction. And in terms of the type of activity, we can improvise, we can try different, we can choose whatever works best for us, and we can also adjust to the conditions and circumstances depending on our life. So I hope that helped you understand more about zone 2, this crucial and one of the most important components of lifestyle and exercise that promotes our health and longevity. And please put your comments below, put additional questions for further Q&As, and I'll see you in the next video.